You want to have a catch?
I'd like that.
Welcome to this special Father's Day episode of Toronto Mic'd. Joining me is Ford C. Frick award-winning broadcaster Dave Van Horne, who spent 32 years calling Montreal Expos games from their inception through the 2000 season, and Russ Taylor's daughter and son, Leslie Taylor and Chris Taylor. Welcome, Leslie and Chris.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Nice to be here.
And welcome back, Dave. Dave, you were my guest for episode 1499, and that deep dive into your career was fantastic. Thanks for hooking up with me again so quickly.
Well, the amazing thing is, after that 1 hour with me, you're still on the air. So
somebody wrote me and said there was 3 hours of content in that 1 hour episode. So I think that's a good thing.
Might have been.
Yeah, and there's still so many Expos fans in Canada, actually all around, but in Toronto, a lot of us displaced Montrealers.
Well,
every day I see Expo hats in the city.
In Montreal.
Not a day goes by where I don't see a handful of Expo hats.
Yeah.
So.
And shout out to the to Steve Cole, who's listening. I believe he is the person behind the Expos in the Wild Twitter account that likes to take photos of Expos hats in the wild and share them on
yeah, whenever I see them, I send them off to him.
Awesome. And it's funny here, just to set the table before I try to get out of the way. Russ Taylor's other child, Leslie and Chris, your youngest sibling, is also an FOTM. So shout out to Carolyn Taylor. And if people want to hear a deep dive with Carolyn, that's episode 1332. But Leslie, this is your first visit to the TMDS studio, right? This is the first time you've been here.
I've never been to New Toronto before.
Really? And has it met your expectations, your lofty expectations?
You know what? It's a little bit smaller than I thought it would be. I was picturing a much
New Toronto
larger,
or the studio?
The studio.
Oh,
yeah.
Well, this is what I've heard. And I want to say hello to Chris. Chris, this is the first time we've met. Where in the world do we find you today?
I'm in Montreal.
How appropriate. Okay, perfect. So... Yeah. And Dave, you were inducted into the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame on June 21st, 2014. So congratulations on that honor. That's well-deserved.
Well, thank you. That means a lot to me because, at the time that I left the Expos, after 32 years, I'd spent over half my lifetime broadcasting Expos baseball. And so to be honored by the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame was major. It stands right there with the honor I received at Cooperstown.
Excellent. And one glaring omission from the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame is that Russ Taylor has not had the same honor bestowed upon him. And my goal today, like I said, I'm going to try to stay out of the way, and I'm going to let you three talk about Russ and make the case as to why he should be inducted into the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame. And Leslie, since you're the oldest of the Taylor kids...
You got to rub that in, right?
But only, right, Chris? Only a year, right, Chris?
1 year. Yeah.
Still,
a year and 3 weeks.
Still, that counts. Okay, so you're the oldest. I'm wondering if you would, start us off by maybe telling me a little bit about your dad, Russ Taylor, who sadly passed away far too soon at the young age of 51 back in August 1977. How old were you in
77? I was 13 or 13 and a half. Yeah.
So start us off here. And then again, I'd love to hear you and Chris and Dave talk about Russ Taylor and make the case for getting Russ Taylor into the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame?
Okay. Well, I'll just start by saying, I mean, he was always a sports guy. And so, you know, more recently, I mean, it's been 7 years or whatever that he's been gone. It's a long time. And, you know, people's memories fade, and the people who remember him are not necessarily around anymore, not all of them. That's why I'm so appreciative that Dave is here, because there's so few people who are still around who remember him and remember listening to him and the impact that he had. But he was a sports guy. He did a lot of Olympics before he did baseball, did, you know, local sports. Probably his very first sort of big thing having to do with baseball, and Chris might correct me on this, but he would have only been about 20 years old when Jackie Robinson made his debut in Montreal with the Royals. So, you know, he was always involved in sports writing back then. And then in 1952, he was the one who convinced, I don't know if it was the CBC or some other radio station, to cover the Little League World Series from Williamsport, Pennsylvania, because there was a team from the Montreal area who was playing, and it was the first time that an international team, a non-US based team, was playing in the Little League World Series. So he was involved in that. That team did not win, but they were participating. I don't know, Chris, if you have any more, or even Dave have any more memories of that?
Well, I think it was CFCF.
Was it for CFCF? Okay.
Yeah, it was CFCF.
Yeah.
I do know from talking to Russ early when we first got together and we were going over our backgrounds, I do know that he spent a lot of time at Delormier Downs as well, following the Montreal Royals.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
And he broadcast for the Royals and in the final years. And and so baseball was all, like Leslie had mentioned, Jackie Robinson. I think Dad started off as a technician, I think in 1948 at CFCF. And then he didn't get into baseball coverage, till the Little League World Series. But then toward the end of the 50s, I think the Royals ended in 1960. He was doing Royals broadcasts then. Yeah.
Okay.
Amazing. Now, let's talk about Expos now. So your dad, Russ, and then we can bring Dave into this, because Dave was there since the beginning, 1969. So your father's involvement with the Montreal Expos, is that from the get-go? Is it just that because he was a local broadcaster who was involved in baseball already?
Yeah. Yeah, he was the first one hired. And I think Dave might have mentioned this in the episode that you had with him last week or the week before. And he was hired first, and then Dave was brought on after.
Okay, so he's like sort of, I don't know if we can call him employee number one, but he's on the broadcasting side, he's probably employee number one.
Yeah, on the broadcasting side. And the other big impact that he had was even as late as August of 68, the Expos still didn't have a stadium to play in. Delormier could not be accommodated. They couldn't expand it to have the number of seats that were necessary. There was also a stipulation that a roof would be put on, and by 1972 that there'd be some type of a dome stadium. It was not capable of doing that. And then the other stadium was called the Autostad, which was where the Alouettes played. That was also not suitable. So for a variety of reasons. So it was my dad and Marcel, is it Desjardins? They were both sports writers in Montreal, who took Warren Giles, then president of the National League, and John McHale, president of the baseball club, up to Jerry Park. In Wikipedia, because I was looking at it this morning, Wikipedia said it was Jean Drapeau, the mayor of Montreal, who encouraged them to look at Jerry Park. And I'm like, I don't think so. I think we need to get someone on that and correct that.
Well, I know a guy. Okay?
You know a guy, yeah.
Rosie Gray T.O. But Dave, what's your memories of Russ Taylor's involvement in the Expos playing their home games at Jerry Park?
At the time that I was hired, spring training was almost over. There were just a few games left to be played over in the Tampa Bay area. The Expos were going to break camp in West Palm Beach, where they had shared a spring training facility with the Atlanta Braves. And actually, it was only about a week or 10 days prior to that I was hired. And the first thing I did after I turned in my notice to my boss in Richmond was to make contact with the Expos. And the only contact that I had with them was a fellow by the name of Ray Blomquist. He was placed in charge of radio broadcasting both French and English that first year. And he told me, he said, well, we have already hired a broadcaster. We have Russ Taylor on board. And he said, I need you to meet Russ. And he said, I need you to come up here to Montreal, get signed in and everything so we can pay you. And I said, okay, I'll get to Montreal. So I got to Montreal, met Russ for the first time. It was a whirlwind couple of days. We didn't even have a chance to drive up to Jarry Park. We were spending all of our time with the people that were hired to sell radio and sell advertising on the radio broadcasts. And then we had to fly to Tampa because the team had left West Palm Beach, and Russ and I flew to Tampa and got started with the Expos there. We watched a couple of exhibition games, and then the National League. Remember back in those days, it wasn't MLB. It was the National League and the American League. They were separate entities who played under the same umbrella, but they were separate entities. Well, the National League decided to welcome not only Taylor and Van Horne, but the entire Expos team to baseball by having them travel to Tampa Bay, then out west to Vancouver and play a couple of exhibition games, then into Milwaukee, Wisconsin to play a couple of exhibition games. And by then, Russ and I have toured the United States. We're now headed to New York to finally play that first game. So it was a whirlwind tour, but it was great for me because Russ and I did a lot of talking, and I have said to this day, I would not have had the success in Montreal that I had it not been for Russ Taylor being beside me. Because Russ not only talked to me about the broadcast history in Montreal with baseball and so forth, but all across Quebec, all across Canada, told me things I had never known before and introduced me to Canadian baseball. And it just wouldn't have been the same without him. And then the often told story that opening day, April 8th, 1969, I'm standing beside Russ, of course, in the broadcast booth, and they're getting ready to play the anthems. And when they played the Canadian anthem, I looked over to Russ, and he had tears streaming down his face. And I thought, this game, this day, this event of Montreal entering Major League Baseball is much bigger than I ever thought it was or dreamt it was. Just by looking at Russ, I could see it on his face.
Yeah, no, I think that was a culmination moment of a lifetime's dream where he loved baseball so much, he loved the city, and to have a team in Montreal, that was the pinnacle for him. And, so I can understand why. And, he had made it as a father too, and everything had come together for him at that point.
Yeah, he loved, baseball and Olympics were his two big loves. He liked all sports, but those are the two that he was really drawn to. And he really got behind. He used to teach us about baseball stuff. He used to give us little quizzes. Like, I still remember one of the quizzes that he gave me. He's like, how can a pitcher not have pitched a ball to home plate and still be the winning pitcher in a game? And that was like the little quiz he would give me. And I'm like, oh God, I got to figure this out. How could that happen? And I figured it out. Like, he picked someone off first base, and then in the bottom of the ninth or whatever, the home team came up to win. And that's how they did it. So he would always give us like little quizzes and stuff like that.
Well, I was going to ask you at a personal level. This is for you, Chris, and you, Leslie. But when you hear Dave Van Horne, the voice of the Expos, talking about your father and the way Dave talks about your father, I'm wondering, because this is Father's Day, the pride you must feel. Like, I have this secondhand pride sitting here, and I can't imagine what it's like to be in your skin. The pride you must feel hearing these words about your father from Dave Van Horne.
Means a lot to me. It does. Sometimes, you think you have a lifetime of memories, and you try to think of the words to come through that bottleneck, And we're at that bottleneck in time, and I have a lot of things to say. But Leslie sent me an email. Said, "Oh, Dave's going to be interviewed by Mike," and said, "Do you have any questions for Dave?" Because Leslie sent a question in. And I said, "I got a million questions for Dave. I can't think of one." But Yeah, I mean, it does. It means so much just to, Dave, make this effort. Thank you so much for coming out today. And
As I've said before, Chris, and I'm repeating myself, but I was just so lucky to have your dad as my partner. I mean, we had never known each other. I was an American. He was a proud Canadian.
right.
We got together, and he was so welcoming to me. He could have sat back and said, hey, wait a minute, this is a Canadian team. I'm the Canadian broadcaster. Why did they have to bring an American in here to sit him down beside me? Never entered his mind, at least certainly not to bring that up to me. He was just so welcoming, and I don't have to tell you guys how much fun your dad was. He had a great sense of humor. He not only loved the game, he loved the people in it. He loved meeting the scouts and the people behind the scenes that weren't in a major league uniform or on the major league field. He loved everybody involved in Major League Baseball, and he would go around that first year especially and introduce himself, and sometimes I was with him, to everybody that he would meet in the different cities that we traveled to. And he was just so outgoing and so pleasant all the time. He never had a bad day.
Well, he was a real people person. And my younger sister, Carolyn, has got that from him. She just has tons of friends and is very likable. I mean, we're likable too, but not to that level. Leslie and I are likable, but we're not on that level. And but yeah, my dad had tons of friends. And you remember from his funeral, the amount of people from the sports world. There was a Stanley Cup champion coach there, and a World Series champion manager, and a Grey Cup, champion coach. Sam Echeverry was there.
Yeah. So the entire baseball team, including two Hall of Famers. Yeah.
Hall of Famers from all the sports world, and he was loved. I've often thought about just how well respected he was, and it always caused me a bit of I would say, like, I don't want to say anxiety, but I always wanted to just sort of back away from that, because I was worried if I'd ever say something that would blemish his reputation or whatever. So I was kind of stepped back from that world, and I'm very grateful that I had him as a father, and to see so much love for him, to this day.
At the one of the things that we've got a recording that was done by Dick Irvin, the great Dick Irvin, the day he died, and they kept referring to him as like the old pro. That's kind of what he was known as, because even though he was 51 when he died, and Mike, you're approaching 50.
What day is it?
And Chris and I are already past that. So we kind of look at that and go, oh, wow. And like, to be considered old at 50 or whatever, but he was very much an old soul. And so they referred to him as the old pro. But, at his funeral, I can't remember who did the eulogy, but somebody said that he actually was more of a young amateur, because he never lost his love for the sport. He was never jaded about it. He, was as enthusiastic about it at the end as he was at the beginning of his career. The one thing, and I get this from him as well, he was a real stickler for the rules. Like, he didn't like it if people tried to bend the rules around, in the sport or whatever. He was very much a by the book kind of person when it came to sports and baseball.
He was old school in the baseball broadcast booth before anybody referred to anyone being old school. But Russ kind of got that going, because everybody liked him around the league. He became very good friends, by the way. He probably mentioned the name Jerry Doggett to you guys, because he would always seek out Jerry after he'd say hello to Vin Scully. Jerry Doggett was Vin's partner. And he and Russ just hit it off. Not that that was the only person in broadcasting that hit it off with Russ. Everybody did. But he became really good friends because they had something in common. They had this tie to Montreal. The Dodgers were tied to Montreal, and the people that were in the Dodger organization had Montreal ties, and Russ, of course, was our Montreal tie as we went around Major League Baseball.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was another thing that that Dick Irvin mentioned in his tribute, was the fact that when my dad was announced as being the one of the members of the broadcast team for the Expos, everyone in sports media in Montreal was really happy about it, because they were like, not that it was like, oh, Dave, no disrespect to you, but it was like, yeah, all is right with the world. I think those are the words that Dick Irvin used. It's like, all is right with the world when one of our own gets to be the voice, or one of the voices of our hometown and only Canadian baseball team at the time.
Those of us who knew him always felt that when he became the announcer for Montreal's Major League Baseball team, it proved there was some justice in the world after all.
And just to let the listenership know really quickly that I will put the entire Dick Irvin tribute to Russ Taylor at the end of this episode, so you can allude to it, and then people can hear it for themselves. And just before I pass the mic right back to Dave Van Horne, as I'm listening, I just want to a quick personal question, I suppose, for you, Leslie, and you, Chris. But do you find Father's Days difficult? Like to lose you were very young when you lost your dad. He sounds like a great dad. Like, I'm learning so much about Russ Taylor. I love this very much. 51 years old, like you pointed out, that's next year for me. Like, and I can't imagine. I can't imagine. So I'm wondering, is it difficult for you on Father's Day that you can't pick up the phone and call your dad in Montreal and say Happy Father's Day?
Like I said, it's been 47 years, right? So I've lived many more years without him than with him. We were also very lucky to have some good father figures in our life. Like my mom's brother, my Uncle Clive, he was a father to us because he and my dad were very, very close, because my Uncle Clive didn't have any brothers. My dad had, 4 or 5 brothers. But my uncle didn't have any brothers. So they were like brothers, Uncle Clive and my dad. And so he was like the father, so that was, the
I always thought of Uncle Clive as an older brother, but
you did? Well, yeah, because
I met Carolyn. So here's Carolyn. I remember her sending me a Father's Day card. She made one in school, and I sort of became the father, I guess, for Carolyn being 8 years older. And I used to take her out back and throw her fastballs, and she could hit. I mean, with not a baseball, tennis balls. We throw fastballs, and she could hit. She learned how to hit. So that was our little, I guess I kind of became the surrogate father figure, even though I was an older brother. But I don't think that if you go back to the day, I guess those first few years after he died, it was very difficult. And then, the wounds heal. But just talking about it now, it brings back the memory, the emotions. But for many years, it wasn't so hard, no.
I think the thing that makes me choke up more than anything is actually that scene in Field of Dreams when Kevin Costner meets his late father, and he's like, "Hey, Dad, want to have a catch?" I'm like, that's like like a gut punch, when you because we used to do that. Yeah, we used to do that.
Oh my goodness. Now, Chris, you said earlier in this that you were asked by your sister if you had a question for Dave when he was on Toronto Mike to his debut a couple of weeks back, and then you said, "A question? I have a million questions."
Right.
This is your opportunity, my friend. Like, I'm going to just back off.
How long is the podcast? I mean,
I'll let you go.
I ask a million?
I will tell you this. I will let you go till I run out of hard drive space on this MacBook here. But please, Leslie and Chris, you got Dave Van Horne here. At some point, we're going to make our pitch for why Russ Taylor should be in the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame. But pepper Dave with your Russ Taylor questions about your dad.
Well, okay, so here's one. Just on the heels of what we were talking about, which was when Dad was hired. Was there anybody else, Dave? Do you know this? If there was anybody else who was considered, like from Canada, that is to say, who was considered to perhaps be, on the level in terms of baseball knowledge, experience in broadcasting, knowledge of the city? Was there anyone else around? Because what you were saying gives me the impression that John McHale didn't hire you to the very end. And was there no one else around that could have competed with my father for that job? I don't know.
Well, I'm not sure. I can guess at this. I never saw a list of those who had applied for the job. I had heard back in those days, that March of 1969, I had heard that there were over 300 applications for the broadcast job.
Right.
I don't know how many of them were from Canada. as opposed to from the United States. So I can't answer that. And I never saw the collection. I just remember the one quote from John McHale driving back from the visit to Jerry Park with Russ, and in the car, and Jim Fanning was along for that ride. And John said, as they approached the downtown area, because everybody was staying at the Windsor Hotel at the time, that's where Expo's headquarters were briefly. And John said to Ray Blomquist, I think they were, excuse me, they were not on the phone, but they were, I think Ray was in that car as well. And he said, Ray, what do we have in the way of English broadcasters other than Russ, who's already been hired? And Ray said, we've got 350 some applications. John said, I can't go through 350 some applications. He said, get that whittled down to 10. And there was a fellow by the name of Lou Martin who had been hired by John to come to Montreal from Richmond, Virginia, to be John's eyes and ears on the construction site of Jerry Park. And Lou Martin popped up and said, I can save you looking at those numbers of applications. He said, in Richmond, there's a fellow doing the Braves games by the name of Dave Van Horne. Why don't you take a look at him? And John did. And that's how lucky I was that Lou Martin happened to be in that car returning to downtown Montreal and mentioned my name. And that led to my interview with John and subsequently being selected to work alongside Russ Taylor.
So Lou Martin was one of the unsung heroes of Expos baseball.
Absolutely. Lou was, at the time John took him out of Richmond, Lou was the general manager of the Richmond Braves. That's the AAA club that I was broadcasting for in the late 60s, 66, 67, and 68. And John took him up there to be his eyes and ears, as I said, on the construction project. But I never saw a list or heard Ray Blomquist or subsequent directors of broadcasting there ever go over that list. And Russ and I never talked about it. I'm sure there was competition for Russ's position with the club as well. Mm-hmm. I have a suspicion there was one thing that was going on behind the scenes at that time. Keep in mind, it's 1969. And I think somebody said to John in that front office, a Montrealer, you can look at all these broadcast applications and look at broadcasters everywhere, but don't look at Toronto. As you know, Toronto and Montreal had this tremendous, heartfelt,
like a rivalry.
Rivalry. Thank you for the word.
Yeah.
And so he said they didn't want to entertain bringing any Toronto broadcaster over to do the games. That I heard that, and I said that figures, because once I got to know what things were like between Montreal and Toronto, it fit right in. But nonetheless, it was a magnificent selection by John McHale to go with Russ Taylor. I think that they probably, just like Russ with everybody, they probably hit it off right away. And John enjoyed the background that Russ had in baseball, going back to his teen years, and his knowledge of baseball in Montreal, his knowledge of Montreal, his knowledge of the politics of Montreal and Quebec. And that was so impressive, I'm sure, to John, just as it was to me.
Excellent.
Yeah, I think that's one of the maybe overlooked things when it comes to the role of a broadcaster in any capacity, any sport or non-sport environment, is the the knowledge they have of the environment that they're in. And I think that might be one of the things that's maybe overlooked about my dad, is all the stuff that maybe happened behind the scenes, that happened before the Expos even played their first game, and the contributions that he made in that regard. And the fact that he was chosen so quickly or so early before a lot of other pieces were in place with the team kind of speaks to how integral he was to the success of the Expos in their first season.
Okay, I have another one of my million questions. So the up and away call. I had heard this. Dave, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I had heard that you were toying with the idea of using up and away, and my dad loved it. He said, "Dave, do it, go for it." But you were hesitant to use it. So one day he used it on a call, and you got really angry with him. You said, that was supposed to be my call. And you said, well, look, if you're not going to use it, I'm going to use it. And that was his way to get you to use it. Now, is that a true story or not?
I do remember that happening, and I was not mad at him. I was taken aback because we had been discussing this call. Right. And I had not yet used it. I think it was probably late April before I used it. And I think it was more the shock that this is the call that I had come up with and we had discussed. And Russ jumped in there with it. And I'm glad he did, because I got to hear what it sounded like.
Yeah.
And I liked it too.
Yeah.
So I went with it, but I don't think I was ever really angry with your dad. He may remember me as being angry. I was more in shock over the fact that I heard that.
The big right-hander holds at the belt. Kicks and deals a 1-0. Dawson swings a drive to left field. It is up and away. The Expos win the game on Dawson's game-winning home run.
Chris, this is amazing, by the way. That's a great question, and that's a wild story. Like, I can't believe we just got that. So how many left in that million questions? Keep going.
Oh, all right. Well, another one I remember was a few years into the 70s. I don't remember which year it was. We went to our families, Dave's family and our family went up to Mont Tremblant and for the All-Star break. And Tim McCarver joined us for that, and him and his family. And I thought it was kind of an odd mixture, because at the time McCarver was a catcher, he was a ball player. And why was he hanging out with these old broadcaster types? Did he show an interest at that time in broadcasting? Do you think your influence may have had an effect on him and his decision to be a broadcaster?
I don't know that either one of us influenced his decision, but I know that he knew his career was winding down, and this was something that he wanted to do. And of course, he went on to become one of the outstanding baseball analysts of all time. And but I remember that summer and going up to Tremblant and the good times that we had, and that Tim and his wife at the time were there. And so he was always close to those of us that have had an association with the Expos, like Tommy Hutton and some others. And it worked out well for Tim McCarver, that's for sure.
Dave, you just mentioned something that kind of just sort of twigged a memory, is this idea of broadcasters versus analysts. So in today's sort of arena, it's typically you've got a broadcast person, and then you've got someone who's usually coming from the sport itself to act as an analyst, someone who's played the game and stuff. But things were different when you guys started, because you both were broadcasters.
Yes, that wasn't uncommon. For example, we used the Dodger booth as an example. Vin Scully and Jerry Doggett were broadcasters and not players. I mean, Vin played college ball, but it wasn't uncommon, especially back during it wasn't until the 70s and 80s that former athletes, former baseball players started to move into the broadcast booth. either on television or on radio. So that was something that happened in our time as Russ and I broke in. And it was one of those things that it spread like wildfire afterwards, because people enjoyed hearing from the people who had been down on the field, who had been through everything there was to go through in baseball. They've been on the field. Now they were in the broadcast booth talking to the fans, and the fans really took to that.
Right. So was it like 74 or 75 that Duke Snider joined the broadcast team? It was.
He first joined on a part-time basis, and then that became full-time. And Duke, to his credit, it wasn't his first broadcast job. He was one of the initial San Diego Padre broadcasters when they came into the league at the same time that the Expos came into the league, 1969. So he had some broadcast experience, and of course, a wealth of knowledge and great history with the Brooklyn Dodgers and so forth. So he brought a lot to the table. But yeah, it was at about that time. As a matter of fact, for a short period of time, all three of us were in the booth at the same time. You may recall that.
Yeah, I do. And, one of the other things I was noticing was I was listening to a few broadcasts the other day, some old tapes. And so I could hear my dad calling the game and you calling the game. And I think the thing that so impressed me about you, Dave, and I heard it in my dad's voice as well, is the cadence of broadcasting baseball, knowing when to pause, when to let the crowd cheer, the pace at which you deliver the information to the audience was so special. And he had it, you had it. And sometimes I'd listen to the old tapes. I said, is that my dad or is that Dave? I couldn't tell. And then I'd wait for a few inflections in the voice. Oh, yeah, Dave's voice is a little bit higher. And but, so that's the thing that I find just so special about baseball broadcasting. Yeah,
I hear you. And one of the things that I thought about, not at the time that it was happening, but in later years when I started to think back to the years that Russ and I shared the booth, was how easily we worked together and fit together and had the same cadence. We didn't have anybody in that booth yelling and screaming. We had two baseball broadcast people that grew up listening to baseball from the 40s and 50s and copied the pace and the feel of the game from those people. Not the voice, but copied the pace and the feel. And Russ and I, we started out that first day, April 8th, 1969. We had that pace of play between us and never left us until we were split up.
Yeah, wow. Before we get back to Chris and Leslie's questions, and again, I am thoroughly enjoying this conversation you're having with Dave Van Horne, but let's hear some Russ. I'd like to hear Russ Taylor's voice, if that's cool. And Leslie, you sent me some clips.
Yeah.
How about Hammer and Hank? You want to set it up possibly?
I think he was, Hank Aaron was sort of on his way to his record-breaking home run. And I think he was, within 20 of the record at that point when he hit this one.
The old 714, right? That Babe Ruth record.
Yeah.
Okay. Here's some Russ Taylor.
Hard hit drive deep into center field. That ball is going, gone. Home run by Hank Aaron. He now needs 17. A 3-run blast has the amount of plays. Take a 7-1 lead.
Wow. Okay, 17 to go to match Babe Ruth's 714 there. Leslie, I was wondering if I could play the call of Rusty Staub throwing a runner out, and then there's a interview.
Yeah, that's my favorite. That is my favorite.
That's the best.
The classic.
Yeah.
All right, but the deal is I'm going to play the call, and then I'm going to play the interview, and then I need to hear all three of you comment on this, okay?
Yeah.
Here's Russ Taylor's call of the throw.
The 1-1. Here's a high fly ball into short right field near the line. Staub is under. Let's see whether he can make the throw. Here comes the throw to the plate. They got up! At the plate, a terrific throw by Rusty Staub. Oh, man, what a throw! A standing ovation for Rusty Staub as they got Leon Jones at the plate. The crowd is up yelling, Staub has made a magnificent throw.
Okay, and then I also have an interview from Russ on Rusty, we'll call this one. Here we go.
Rusty, right after you made the throw, you made a beeline for the clubhouse, and this brought a lot of laughter from a lot of people in the stands. They're all wondering. There was a long wait, perhaps about 5 minutes. And finally, when you arrived back in the stadium, it reminded me at times of watching the Olympic marathon after the marathoner runs 26 miles, 385 yards, whatever the distance is. There, everybody is waiting in suspense for the man to re-enter the stadium for the final kick home. And that's just how it appeared, and a big roar went up from the crowd when you made your appearance. Tell us just what happened.
Well, Russ, a combination of things, really. When I made the throw, I kind of, overextended myself, and I guess my pants were a little too tight, and I tore them a little bit, and I've also had a little trouble with my stomach, so I just, I went inside, and, as nature calls sometimes, I just told the umpire, I said, I've got to go change my pants, and when I went inside, I just, had to do my little thing there, and so it took me a little while to get back out.
Okay, Rusty, thanks very much, and congratulations once again.
Russ, that's an all-timer.
I've been speaking with Rusty Staub. Now, stay tuned for the post-game scoreboard show with Dave Van Horne, coming up in just 1 minute.
Play-by-play account of this game.
Yeah, he could not contain his laughter.
Dave Van Horne and Russ Taylor cover Expos baseball throughout the season exclusively on CFCF. That's
Yeah, I had to do my little thing.
Yeah.
It was crazy because, as Russ described, as soon as the ball was thrown to the plate and the out was called, the inning was over, and Rusty, instead of heading to the dugout, headed down the left field line from right field, cut across the field, and I don't know if it was the second base umpire or the third base umpire, but one of them said to him, "Where are you going?" Because they knew that's where the clubhouse was, down the left field line, through a little gate, and the clubhouse was around the corner under the left field bleachers. And so Rusty told him, he said, I got to go change my pants.
Well, I have
and then made, as Russ described, made this grand entrance back into the stadium with this shiny pair of white home pants on.
is that 69 or 70 or when was that?
Oh, good question, Chris. I don't think Rusty was there for 3 years. I don't think it was the first year. It could have been 69 or 70, but I'm leaning toward 1970 only.
The reason why I asked that question is because it's a legendary story in my family at my house. And growing up as a kid, I remember my dad recounting that story to me when I was a young boy. And of course, I loved Rusty Staub. He was my idol. And one day we had the good fortune of picking up Rusty Staub he lived at Westmount Square, sort of down just off of de Maisonneuve. And so we picked him up to take him down to the ballpark. And there he was, Rusty Staub, sitting in the front seat in front of me, this grand orange hair right in front of me. I said, I'm going to ask Rusty Staub this question. I said, and my parents had always told me this story. Said that the time Rusty Staub split his pants. That's what they said. They said he split his pants. And I'm like, oh, okay. So I thought so I asked Rusty, I said, Rusty, tell me about the time you split your pants. Everybody just laughed in the car, and I didn't really understand what had happened. I just thought he had torn his pants, and that was it. So.
I didn't know that. Chris.
Were you in the car?
I don't know, maybe.
Oh, you wouldn't remember that?
Vaguely remember. Yeah, I have a bad memory.
Okay.
Chris, that's why you're here. You've got the memory. Any more questions here for Dave? We've got Dave Van Horne here talking Russ Taylor for Father's Day. This is awesome.
Well, practical jokes. My dad liked to play jokes, and he loved it when people played jokes on him. I was reading in the obits the other day from after my dad passed away. Dave was telling a story, and I'd love him to tell it again. about when Dave trolled my dad and convinced him that the wrestlers, that he had to broadcast the wrestlers who were wrestling on the dugout or something like that.
That was one of the put-ons with Russ. He loved them. He loved every one of them. So the Expos were getting ready to head out on the road, and one of the things they had scheduled for Jerry Park while the team was on the road was a full-scale wrestling match. They were promoting ticket sales for this wrestling match, and so I got thinking, and I talked to Ted Blackman. I said, they've got these wrestlers coming here. They're going to be in seats behind home plate. I've got to do something with that. And Ted said, tell Russ he's got to describe the wrestlers. And I said, yeah, okay, I'll see what. So my mind was a whirl, and I went down to the broadcast booth, thought about it, and I said, Russ, by the way, I forgot to tell you this. John McHale called me in the office this afternoon, and tonight there's going to be 2 wrestlers that are appearing next week when the team's gone in the matches that are taking place at Jerry Park. They're going to be sitting behind home plate, and they're going to break out into a fight behind home plate. And it's during your inning, so you've got to describe this fight that's going on between the 2 wrestlers, and I'll get the names for you behind home plate while you're doing your innings there. And he looked at me like I was crazy. And I said, well, John said we've got to do that, and it's set up for that inning, and that's your inning, so you've got to describe this. and then I said, after you do all that, I'll jump in and do a ticket promo announcement, but you've got to describe these wrestlers. And Russ threw his pencil down. He stood up, pushed his chair back. He was visibly upset, and he said, I'm not going to do that. And I said, well, this is orders from John McHale. This is what he wants done. And Russ said, well, I'm going to go find John, and if he makes me do that, I will quit right here tonight on the spot. I will quit this job. I'm not a wrestling promoter. I'm a baseball broadcaster. And he stormed out of the booth, going to look for John McHale. So I got up slowly, and I looked to see which way he had gone. One or 2 ways. If you turn to the right, you're going to go down the steps that lead from the broadcast booth behind home plate at Jerry down to the main concourse. Or if you go to the left, you're going to the press box. For whatever reason, he went to the left. And there stood Ted Blackman down there right at the head of the writers section. And Ted said, Russ, what's wrong? And Russ told Ted, and Russ said, well, that's a tough job. But don't go looking for John McHale and quit your job, Russ. You can't quit over. He said, I'm not going to do this. I won't be a part of this tawdry promotion of wrestling. And he turned away from Ted, and he started heading down and now I'm down there as well. And Ted says, you got to take him off the hook. He's going to go find John and scream and yell at him. I said, Russ doesn't scream and yell. Ted says, take him off the hook. So I caught up with Russ, and I took him off the hook, and he just broke out into that big belly laugh of his, and he thought it was the greatest put on he'd ever been a part of.
I think he had said something. You had told him that he had to tell the audience, come on down and see the Brutes this Saturday night.
Yeah.
And then there was the Jerry Park security squad that was supposed to come down and fight the wrestlers or something had happened like that. So,
yeah, I think that was part of the story that I concocted for Russ that he
right.
had to describe. And
because you set it up. You set it up. You said that, describe how the wrestlers are going to wrestle on behind the Expos dugout, and the security detail would come down and they'd get beaten up, and then Russ would come out and say, come see the Brutes this Saturday night.
Yeah, that was about it. And but he loved it. I know he told the story often, and I sure did. And it was a put on, and Russ loved put ons.
Yeah.
You got any more there, Chris?
Yeah. I'd like to know about some of your favorite restaurants. Do you have any food stories? My dad liked to eat, as you know, and
I'll tell you one. I could tell you many, because when we had off days on the road, especially, we would go out to dinner together. And one of his favorite places was a steakhouse in Chicago, Gene and Giorgetti's. Okay. And we went there often. So we're at Gene and Giorgetti's, and we both ordered a steak and all the trimmings that come with it and everything. And this was actually in 1969, and one of the first couple of times that I'd been out to dinner with Russ. Now, I will be the first to admit that I'm a very finicky steak eater. I do a lot of work with the knife and fork in trimming anything that I think might be fat or gristle off the steak before I start to eat it. And about the time I finished my process of doing all that, Russ was pushing his plate away and it was empty. I said, Russ, when did you start eating so fast? And he said, well, you have to understand. He said, I grew up in a household with 5 other people at the table, and none of us were allowed to have seconds on any food until our plate was clean. So I learned to beat everybody else to the remaining food by cleaning my plate before anybody else could even think about cleaning their plate. And he said, I've been eating fast ever since then.
Yeah, there were 9 kids in my dad's family, so there was a lot of jostling for position. And then he turned around and would do the same thing with us. He would say things like, oh, look at that bird out the window, and we'd turn to look out the window and he'd steal food off our plates, like stuff like that.
That stuff.
Oh my goodness. All right, now before I know how I want to close this episode, but I don't want to end this call. And Chris is like, I didn't get a chance to ask this question I've been wondering for how many years. Or Leslie, you too, of course. I know Chris has the memory in the family.
No, I'll defer to Chris. I think I've said my piece.
Like, so Chris, and again, I don't want to leave any of these questions, on the cutting room floor, so to speak. So this is your chance.
I think at this point, it's more wanting to share good memories, really, than questions.
Sure.
But definitely, and thank Dave for all the years that I listened to Dave, even after my father passed away. I listened to, I wouldn't say every game, but I listened to all over the world. I listened to Dave on the internet in 2000 from Singapore. And I had to log off a computer, shut down a computer to download the real player so I could listen to Dave. And Dave's talking about, the amazing qualities of the internet and saying, that's the great thing about the internet. You just never know who's listening. And he had got an email from Woody Fryman, I guess from his farm in Kentucky. And I'm like listening. I'm listening, Dave. I had no way of telling him. But just so many great memories, and the calls, the games, the players. And, it was terrible. My mom loved Dave so much. And back when the Expos were a really good team in the late 70s, early 80s, we'd be watching the game and Dave would be doing the broadcast on TV. And then my mom would sort of saunter in, are they winning? And say, yeah, they're winning. But the moment my mom would come in, everything would unravel, always, And I said, well, so we thought she was cursed. It was like a hex or something. But one day we ran into Warren Cromartie at some function, and Crow took the hex off, and after that, everything was good. So
That's great. That's great. Should I play, Leslie? You sent me some clips, but maybe I could play another one. Is there another one of these clips you'd like me to play?
I'm trying.
Putting us about okay, so we got a Grand Slam call that
the Grand Slam.
Let's hear a Grand Slam call from Russ Taylor.
The pitch to Bailey. Hard hit ball deep into left field. Going way back is Aaron. That ball is gone. A Grand Slam home run for Bob Bailey on the first pitch. And the Expos are back in the game.
Okay, the Grand Slam for Bob Bailey. That's amazing. And what about Boots Day single?
I think because that was a game. I don't know if it was game winning or they took the lead or something.
It was a pinch hit, definitely a pinch hit. Let's listen to this as well. Here's some more Russ.
0-2. Brewer is ready. The pitch. Day, ground ball right side, base hit. Expos win by a score of 6-5. Boots Day with a pinch hit single.
One of our favorites, Charles Frederick Day.
Yeah, Boots Day.
Yeah.
I was going to say, in the days before we called those walk-offs, right? I always think of when Joe Carter touches them all in '93. Much love to the late great Tom Cheek. Speaking of play-by-play analysts who didn't play professional baseball, that was Tom Cheek and Jerry Howarth too. So that's how it was back then.
When Dave and Duke would be doing the television broadcasts, my dad and Tom Cheek would be doing the radio. And that's where I first was introduced to Tom Cheek. And then the Jays landed in Toronto. I guess it was in '77.
Yeah.
And Tom moved over there at that point. But he always sounded great. And I was like, I love listening. Actually, Dave, I hate to admit this, but when you'd be doing the TV broadcast, we turn the sound down and then we turn up my dad and Tom Cheek. But it wasn't anything personal. I think.
Oh, he couldn't take that personally. You're listening to your dad.
The same thing to listen to my dad.
Yeah, exactly.
It would be strange if you didn't do that. I'd argue.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's argue. And we did, in the episode I did with you, Dave, we talked at great lengths about your relationship with the late Tom Cheek, and it sounded wonderful as well.
Well, Tom was working in Burlington, Vermont, as I think everybody knows, or at least back in the day, they knew that. And when we ran into some situations where we had trouble covering all of the innings that needed to be done when I was working television, and at the time, we were always going to Plattsburgh, New York, and Burlington, Vermont during the winter on the Caravan. And we'd be there to sell tickets. And Tom Cheek would always be the host of the luncheon that we would all go to, Russ and myself and everybody else with the Expos and the players that they took down there, and would go to lunch, and Tom would be the MC. So John McHale asked me, he said, do you have any suggestions as to who could work with Russ when you're on television? And I said, number one on my list would be Tom Cheek down in Burlington. And so one thing led to another. They got a hold of Tom Cheek, and Tom Cheek started that series of broadcasts with Russ when I was doing TV with Duke.
And was there only like one or two games a week that were on TV? Maybe one? Sometimes two?
Yeah, the television schedule was not very, but when we first started out, I think the TV schedule was somewhere between 15 and 18 games for the year.
Right.
That grew a little bit a few years later to where there were 20, 25 games. And then it continued to grow until, I don't know, I'm going to say the most we ever did was probably 35, 40 games on TV.
Sort of question for Dave. I had memories of those early TV broadcasts being on Wednesdays and Saturday.
Yes.
Is there any like video footage of those old games from Jerry Park or even the road games from the 70s?
Well, you know what? Thanks to the CBC, the answer is no. The number of times that we were looking to get video of games, I didn't acquire a video of a game that I did on CBC until Dennis Martinez's perfect game in 1991.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was it was tough back in the day. Russ and I, when the game on April 8, 1969 was over, I don't know who said it first, but I think I turned to Russ and I said, Russ, because he knew everybody at the radio station that had carried our games at CKGM. He said, I said, you've got to call over there right now and get copies of the audio of our broadcast. Said, get one for you, get one for me, and we got to get one to give to John McHale so the ball club has one. So we got back to the hotel. Russ said, I'll meet you at the bar as soon as I make this call to Montreal about the tape. And he called Montreal and he asked the question, can you make some tape copies of the broadcast so that Dave and I can have one, and John McHale can have one for the club, for the record. There's a long pause on the phone, and the voice replied, "We didn't record the game."
Wow. What a shame.
So game 1, 1969, April 8th, first Expos game in history. About 10 to 15 years later, I got a call from a guy in Chicago who's a baseball nut and who has spent most of his life, you're nodding your head, yes, Mike, who has spent most of his life recording games. He had a recording of the first game, the April 8th game. So we belatedly, I was able to get a copy of that. And it's not even the entire game. It starts, as I recall, the tape starts with Russ doing the lineups, and then myself for a few innings. I think Russ is on there for a few innings. And then long about the 7th or 8th inning, it just sort of petered out. We never got the final score or anything on that tape. We've been able to piece it together since then. But there was this station in Montreal, and I know this was a new gig, Major League Baseball on the air, but my goodness, they didn't record the game.
Yeah, unbelievable.
That is wild here.
My dad had worked on. He had taped. The station CFCF had all the tapes of the games. Obviously not the opening game. Maybe they started recording them after that because they realized they had messed up.
Right.
So that's why he was able to compile a lot of that old footage, and he put together what was going to be a record, a promo record that he was going to sell or have the baseball team sell. Which was a retrospective on the Expos, maybe the first 5 years or something like that. And it was a compilation of Dave and my dad in the broadcast booth calling all the great calls. But they said, we can't do it. And why not? And they said, because the French broadcast, they hadn't recorded theirs. So was that just a thing in those days, that just not to record?
Well, I don't know. I can't speak for the stations, and I'm not too sure. I know that there was always an issue in those early years between the stations that broadcast the French feed and the English feed. There was always something going on there that wasn't healthy from a broadcast standpoint.
Okay.
And had trouble getting a lot of replays and so forth that we tried to collect. And then we're told the same thing. Well, we can't put this together and publish this unless we also have a French version, and right. There is no, they didn't have the ability to do that. So that was tough. But I to this day remember Russ coming down to the bar and saying, "You're not going to believe this." I said, "Try me." He said, "I called the station. They didn't record the game." Wow. I looked at him and I said, "I know what this is. This is a put on. You're putting me on. You're trying to get me.
Yeah.
But it's not going to work. When do we get the copies?" He said, "Dave, they didn't record the game." And so that was the end of that.
Wow. And in 69, that's about a decade too early for when many, many homes had VCRs, and you would have had many people recording a big event like that. In 69, you're lucky you got any recording at all. Now, Chris, I heard you were going to say something there, but just to set the table here. So when we're going to close by going around the Van Horne, if you will. Okay. So we're going to go Leslie, then you, Chris, and we're going to close with Dave. Essentially a pitch to get Russ Taylor in the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame. But just before we do that around the Van Horne, I'm wondering if Dave, what are your memories of the Taylor kids back in the day in Montreal?
Well, I have fond memories of seeing them at times coming to the ballpark, and then coming up to the booth area after the game was over and so forth. The thing that I remember most it happened in 1976. my wife, Nancy Lee, and the 4 boys, we lived on the West Island. So we were out there on the West Island, and unfortunately, at the Montreal Neurological Institute, my wife passed away following brain surgery, and I was left with 4 boys. And it was a whirlwind time there in February and early March of 1976. And I say that because out of the clear blue, here comes Russ Taylor with his kids in tow in the car. And he came to the front door of our place there in Kirkland, and he said, round the boys up. He said, I'm going to take everybody down to see the progress being made at Olympic Stadium, so they can get a look at it and see what the future home is going to be like and where it is and everything. And he did that. And my boys have never forgotten it. I never forgot it. I didn't go along because I was up to my ears in other things. But I know that the boys to this day have, whenever the name Taylor comes up, they mention that, how much that meant to them to spend that time at that horrible time in their life with the Taylor kids to go see the progress at Olympic Stadium.
Dave, that was awful. That was awful. I remember it very well. And I remember Nancy was such a cool woman. And I remember when we drove in the car that day, there was, you could hear a pin drop. We drove out. It was a miserable day out to the Big O. And your boys were there. And we didn't say much. We just drove around the Big O and watched the progress. And
yeah.
Yeah, I remember my mom was very fond of Nancy as well. They were very good friends.
She taught me the term a hat trick. Oh. I'd never heard that term before. And I'd scored a hat trick in my league. And I said, I scored 3 goals. And she says, oh, you got a hat trick. I said, oh, really? What's that? What's 3 goals? All right.
Yeah, I'm sorry for your loss there as well, and that's a great story, though, a great memory of the Taylors, and it's nice to hear that when the Taylors are brought up, there's a great positive feelings attributed to that. Okay, now Chris, let me give you one last question here before we go around the horn. I know I promised an hour, but this was too beautiful to contain in 1 hour. So, do you have one final question for Dave, and then we'll go around the horn, because it sounds to me, as an independent observer here, that Russ Taylor belongs in the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame. So we're going to make our pitches. But Chris, do you have a final question for Dave?
I probably do, but I'm drawing a blank.
Well, that's okay. That's okay. I found this last hour to be like funny, interesting, and emotional. I was really touched by a lot of these stories I heard, and there were moments there, even that story that Dave just told, where I could feel my body like. Goosebumps on my body. I could feel it in my core here. So this was a very a beautiful, tender episode. Leslie, you're here in the basement. Yeah. I could reach out and mess up your hair here.
My helmet hair from my bike ride over.
That's the only way my hair rocks, is helmet hair. Your dad belongs in the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame.
Yeah, for a couple of reasons. So Dave's in the Hall of Fame. Jacques Doucette is in the Hall of Fame, who was the French broadcaster for the Expos. So it's about time that Russ Taylor gets into the Hall of Fame. I think we tend to think about longevity when we're talking about impact in broadcasting or in anything. And Dave certainly had longevity. My dad did not have longevity. It was only like 6 seasons or 7 seasons of broadcasting. But I think impact-wise, we talked about this right off the top, his impact on baseball in Montreal, not just the Expos, but with the Royals as well. And I think that makes him deserving of being included in the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame.
The 2-0. Hard hit ball deep into left field. That ball is going. It is gone. We've got a tie ball game. Bob Bailey has just hit it out. Expos 5, the Dodgers 5. What a poke by Bob Bailey. A dramatic ninth-inning home run. His 22nd of the year for Bob Bailey. 5 RBIs. A standing ovation here at Jerry Park. What a clout by Beats into the bleachers.
Chris.
Yeah. Well, it's very subjective because he's my dad, but I can tell you why I want him to be in the Hall of Fame. And certainly, as my father and my recollections of him, I grew up, nurtured in baseball, fertile baseball grounds. He was always talking about baseball. When you go back to what he did originally, which was to get CFCF to broadcast that Little League World Series in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, and then on to the great Montreal Royals broadcasting there. And then in that hiatus period, between when the Royals left and the Expos arrived in '69, he was accumulating his connections in baseball, and he was hired like that by McHale because, as was mentioned earlier, the people in the business, they knew that my dad was the guy. And I was asking Dave that question. I said, well, who else would have they hired at that time? I mean, there must have been other people that knew baseball as well as my dad, but was there anybody who had the experience and the knowledge and the Montreal aspect that my father did? And I don't think there was. That's why it was so difficult for John to find someone else until he fortunately got Dave. That's I guess that's what I would say. And I think, because he died at 51, he never really got to completely flush out his career. I think that's the thing kind of holding him back. Otherwise, you would have a lot of people now, I suppose, who are voting that would have strong or fond memories of my father that might not know who he is. So.
Well, we're educating people today. And before I turn to Dave Van Horne to take us home, can you tell me about the photo I see over your right shoulder? So this is for you, Chris. Sorry. Yeah.
Sorry, my right shoulder.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So there he is. He's with Jackie Robinson.
So that's your dad, Russ Taylor, with Jackie Robinson.
Yeah. He's, I guess it was a photo taken, looks to me, in the 1960s at some point. I know my dad was doing sort of teletape broadcasts of the World Series from New York at some point, would have been maybe late 50s or early 60s, along with a Japanese broadcaster. And so he was still involved in that point. He must have met Jackie along the way during that time period. Yeah.
Well, it's a great photo, man. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's awesome. I love it. Yeah.
All right, Dave. Thanks again, Dave, for returning to the program. Thank you, Chris and Leslie, for doing this for a Father's Day special. Now, Dave, why does Russ Taylor belong in the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame?
Well, all of the things that we have mentioned, the person who was primarily responsible for the league when they were about to move the franchise before it ever existed in Montreal. They were about to move it to Buffalo or any number of other cities that were mentioned as a possible place to relocate that franchise. And Russ came in and certainly made a day and career-saving decision for Expos fans everywhere by finding Jerry Park and taking John and the group up there to see it. That's just one small thing that he did. His pride in Canada, his pride in Montreal, and the history of Canada and Montreal when it came to baseball. Russ was always just so proud of being a Canadian number one and a baseball fan number two. And it was wonderful. Although a short-lived time that I had to work with him, I wish it had gone on forever. I wish he and I had been able to spend our entire careers doing that. And by the way, speaking of pictures, I'm going to try to show this to you because I think it is a collector's item. Now,
oh, yeah, I think that's a postcard. I might have one of those.
I've got it right here.
Oh, wow.
I've got it.
You probably have it right here. Have it? You have that?
Yeah.
But I'll tell you what you might not have. As I move it, it's autographed by both of us.
Nice.
Yeah. I don't have the autograph.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So autographed by both of us. So I
don't know if
cherish that.
You can get a shot of this, maybe. Can you see that?
Oh, that's the parade photo.
Yes, the parade photo.
Yeah, I guess it was it before the first season or after the first season that there was a big parade in Montreal for the Expos?
It was early in the season.
Okay.
The parade was not March 8th. A lot of people think the parade was April 8th, because the team was in New York. So there was no parade there for the Expos. When they came home on the 14th, there was no parade. But a few days after that, the team had a day off, and then they held the parade. And I remember reading and hearing at the time that there were well over 150,000. Some people guessed as many as 200,000 people came out to line the downtown Montreal streets for that parade.
Wow.
I remember that because I remember the whole thing culminated at Place Ville Marie, and there was a huge crowd of people and Expo players dressed up. And I remember meeting Jim Gosger, and he gave me his Donald Duck impersonation. That's my memory.
Chris, you have a way better memory than I do for stuff like that.
That's why he's here. And Leslie, thanks for riding over here from appropriately named Leslieville.
Leslieville, yes.
And we're going to take a photo by the Toronto tree. Okay. And Chris, good to meet you. Thanks for
nice to meet you too.
Joining us from Montreal. And of course, Hall of Famer Dave Van Horne. Hopefully one day, Dave, you'll be joined in the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame. You'll be joined by Russ Taylor, and all the Taylor kids can be in St. Mary's there for the induction ceremony. That's my hope. That's my dream. Thank you so much for doing this.
Well, it's my honor and privilege to spend time with you guys. This one means a lot to me to have both Leslie and, of course, Chris on board. So, guys, thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I'll continue to do all I can do. I have a vote. I have one vote. We get the ballot each year, and we're asked to list 1 through 10. Weight giving to number 1 on through 10. And I have had Russ on my ballot, I think, every year that I've voted. I can't go back to the first couple of years. Memory fails me. Yeah. But I think I've had him on all my ballots. I think that it goes without saying that it's Toronto weighted. Just because of its location,
right,
and the number of people that are involved, and I'm not blaming the Blue Jays, Toronto baseball for anything. I'm just saying it is weighted heavily there, but it's gotten a little bit better, particularly in the writers department, the last few years. So maybe the door is slowly being pushed open, and maybe this will be the year. I know I'm going to continue to work at it and continue to talk to my fellow voters about Russ Taylor.
Dave, here's an important question for you. Was my dad involved in organizing the Pearson Cup, which was the meeting between the Blue Jays and the Expos?
I'm not sure I can answer that, Chris. I don't recall. I mean, of course, I remember the Pearson Cup, and
I thought he had something to do with organizing that.
He might well have had something to do with it, because he was close to and regarded fondly by John McHale, and I think John would have listened to everything and anything Russ had to offer in the way of promotion for baseball. So it could have been that the Pearson Cup was one of those things that Russ was involved in. I think back a lot of days now and can't remember at age 84 whether or not I remember seeing pictures of something or I actually saw it happen.
Right.
in baseball. And
we're all getting there.
I go through that all the time.
Yeah.
So if you are out there listening to us right now, this Father's Day episode of Toronto Mic'd, and you have a vote, please consider voting for Russ Taylor to have him inducted into the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame. He's worthy of this honor, and it's long overdue. So if you have a vote, use it wisely. Vote for Russ.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Terrific job, Mike.
This is Dick Irvin, Sports Director of CFCF Radio in Montreal, with the pregame show on this Expos broadcast of the Expos Atlanta Braves doubleheader, which will come your way with Dave Van Horne and Duke Snider from the Olympic Stadium in Montreal. This morning, all of the people connected with the Expos and everyone connected with sport of any kind in Montreal and indeed in Canada were shocked and saddened by the news of the sudden death of Russ Taylor, currently the Expos Director of Communications, and for the first 8 seasons of the Expos, their play-by-play broadcaster on radio, along with Dave Van Horne and latterly Duke Snider as well. Here at CFCF Radio, the archives contain many moments that Russ shared with all of us, and the Expos broadcast crew have requested that we play a few of those moments for you now. In the broadcasting business in Montreal, we always referred to Russ Taylor as the old pro. His association with CFCF goes back into the early 50s and before, perhaps. His love of sport goes back much further than that. One of his earliest jobs was as the radio technician at the Montreal Forum, and it was there he heard a broadcaster from the Maritimes doing an amateur game. A few years later, he recommended that same broadcaster to those handling Canadians' broadcasts, and that is how Danny Gallivan came to Montreal. Russ was the morning sportscaster for many years on CFCF Radio, and when television arrived, he became part of that scene too. But first and foremost, Russ's love was baseball. When they were looking for a place in which to play Major League Baseball in Montreal, it was Russ Taylor who told Warren Giles and John McHale about Jerry Park. He was with them the first time they walked into the park. He was there the first and last times the Expos played there. He was the play-by-play man alongside Dave Van Horne and latterly Duke Snider from the first game through to the end of last season when he became the Director of Communications for the ball club. Russ loved Jerry Park. He loved the broadcasts, and he loved baseball. And he was one of the broadcasters at a microphone when Hank Aaron hit one of his record-setting home runs.
Hard hit drive deep into center field. That ball is going, gone. Home run by Hank Aaron. He now needs 17. A 3-run blast as the Atlanta Braves take a 7-1 lead.
Well, Russ, like everybody else, could get excited when Hank Aaron hit a home run, but not the way Russ Taylor could get excited when the Expos hit a home run, especially if it was a grand slam.
The pitch to Bailey. Hard hit ball deep into left field. Going way back is Aaron. That ball is gone. A grand slam home run for Bob Bailey on the first pitch. And the Expos are back in the game.
Russ was one of the few homegrown play-by-play men in baseball. He loved the life, he loved the travels, he loved sitting around talking baseball, playing trivia, and he loved the Expos.
The 2-0. Hard hit ball deep into left field. That ball is going. It is gone. We've got a tie ball game. Bob Bailey has just hit it out. Expos 5, the Dodgers 5. What a poke by Bob Bailey. A dramatic 9th inning home run. His 22nd of the year. For Bob Bailey, 5 RBIs. A standing ovation here at Jerry Park. What a clout by Beats into the bleachers. 0-2. Brewer is ready. The pitch. Day, ground ball right side, base hit. The Expos win by a score of 6-5. Boots Day with a pinch hit single.
The last time Russ Taylor worked on an Expos broadcast, 2 nights ago, and the Expos defeated the Philadelphia Phillies 13-0. Perhaps, if you want to look at it that way, a fitting end to Russ's broadcasting career. Those of us who knew him always felt that when he became the announcer for Montreal's Major League Baseball team, it proved there was some justice in the world after all. Today was Russ Taylor's birthday.
1-1 pitch on the way. Swung on, sharp grounder, Wills has it, bobbles it, throw to first, in time! He did it! A no-hitter! A no-hitter! A no-hitter for Bill Stoneman!
Well, Russ Taylor took off immediately, and Russ, this is quite a historic night, and you had an opportunity to talk with Bill Stoneman?
Yes, I did. Honest to goodness, I was standing by the Expos dugout. I didn't want to put a jinx on them or anything. I was standing in the crowd, and to hear the crowd cheering with every pitch was really something to hear down there. And as soon as Maury Wills made that final put-out, bobbled the ball slightly and threw over to Ty Klein at first base, I dashed out onto the field, followed Bill Stoneman into the dugout, and I recorded the following interview with him. Here I am with Bill Stoneman. He has just pitched a no-hit, no-run game. Bill, how do you feel?
I feel great. It's the greatest thing yet.
What were your feelings when you let that last pitch go to Darren Johnson?
Oh, I thought he was looking for it, and he was, and it just happened to be hitting the right place.
Maury knocked it down. My heart went right in my mouth.
Maury did a beautiful job. He's great. He's the greatest.
Bill, did you realize you had a no-hitter going?
I realized it.
From where? All along?
Oh, I would say maybe from the third or fourth.
What were your feelings as you started the bottom half of the ninth inning? The fans gave you a standing ovation here.
It just weakened me a little bit. I'd never had anything like that, and I just couldn't believe it. I really couldn't believe it.
Bill, have you ever pitched a no-hitter before?
Never. This is it.
You know, you pitched a great game in Chicago last week until the team got into a little trouble. Oh, Rusty Staub has just emptied a can of beer all over you, Bill.
That's all right. That's all right. He can do that every time we win a game.
Congratulations once again.
Thank you very much, Russ.
The 1-1. Here's a high fly ball into short right field near the line. Staub is under it. Let's see whether he can make the throw. Here comes the throw to the plate. They got up at the plate. A terrific throw by Rusty Staub. Oh, man, what a throw. A standing ovation for Rusty Staub as they got Cleon Jones at the plate. The crowd is up yelling. Staub has made a magnificent throw.
Well, Russ, a combination of things. Really, when I made the throw, I kind of, overextended myself, and I guess my pants were a little too tight, and I tore them a little bit. And I've also had a little trouble with my stomach, so I just, I went inside, and, as nature calls sometimes, I just told the umpire, said, I've got to go change my pants. And when I went inside, I just, had to do my little thing there, and so it took me a little while to get back out.
Okay, Rusty, thanks very much, and congratulations once again.
Russ, that's an all-timer.
I've been speaking with Rusty Staub. Now, stay tuned for the post-game scoreboard show with Dave Van Horne coming up in just 1 minute.
Play-by-play account of this game is strictly prohibited without the express of Montreal Expos Baseball Club Limited. Stay exclusively on CFCF. That's more.
Did he give me the cue yet?